My talk is, in a sense, part of this quite high-powered international research workshop that we are hosting at the moment at the IGN, at the Institute for Social Change and Sustainability. And this research workshop explores the changing meaning and also the changing function of political participation in our contemporary societies. That is, in societies which are experiencing what I call the post-democratic turn. Now, my talk tonight is not going to be so much about participation as such, but it is about the post-democratic turn. And this post-democratic turn is, in a sense, another term for what we have been discussing for a number of decades now as the crisis of democracy. And in my talk tonight, I want to explain in some detail why I think that what we are confronted with today is quite different and I think much more challenging, actually, than what over the decades we have been discussing as the crisis of democracy. I think actually there is a qualitative difference, and it is this qualitative difference that makes me think that we should no longer talk about a crisis of democracy, but that we should look for a better descriptor, that we should look for a more meaningful, for a more specific term. And in a sense, the term post-democratic turn is more suitable because it captures, for example, that we are not talking about a temporary irritation that will in due course be overcome and that we then will return to a state of stability or whatever. But with my term, the legitimation crisis of democracy, I actually want to go a step further than with this term, the post-democratic turn. Now, I will later explain in some detail why exactly or what exactly I mean when I'm talking about the legitimation crisis of democracy. But prior to that, I want to say a few more words why we at the IGN take an interest in the state of democracy in contemporary societies at all. After all, we are not a politics department. And the WIen as a whole is a university of economics and business, and quite a number of our colleagues actually at this university explicitly do not regard what they are doing as social science. So one might think that with what we are doing in our institute and what we are doing tonight here, we are kind of out of sync with what the university is doing. And our interest at the IGN in the condition and in the development of democracy derives from the close connection that is commonly made between sustainability, which is, of course, our core concern in the Institute, and democracy. Indeed, sustainability and democracy are widely regarded as two dimensions of the same political project, the emancipatory project, as the new social movement since the 1970s had framed it, and as some social movements are pursuing it, I think, up to the present day, and we've heard some talks about that today. And not only for the social movements, but in mainstream politics and in mainstream policy making too, one of the core commitments and the core principles is that any transformation to sustainability must be and can only be a democratic one. The commitment to democratic transition to sustainability is codified in virtually every policy document on sustainability, suggesting that there is no sustainability without democracy. But in recent years, there is mounting evidence that in contemporary societies, democracy itself may be unsustainable. Put differently, I think there's mounting evidence that democracy depends in a number of respects, in material terms, in cultural terms, on resources, on preconditions which it cannot itself reproduce. And that therefore, the progressive exhaustion of these very resources also signals the exhaustion, or may signal the exhaustion of democracy itself. Now, in material terms, it is increasingly obvious that democracy depends on economic growth. But as it is also increasingly obvious that economic growth can only be sustained at enormous costs, there is now a lot of debate on the question whether democracy can actually be sustained into a society that may be called a post-growth society, a society where economic growth rates are consistently low. And in non-material terms, the big push since the 1970s for a real democratization of our constitutional democracies was fueled not least by a major shift in social value preferences in post-material societies from traditional value orientations, socially predetermined identities, and essentially bourgeois ideals of personality and character, to modern values of self-expression, self-realization, self-experience, that is, to a new emphasis on politics of personal identity. But today, there's a lot of concern in the context of right-wing populism that exactly this focus on identity politics and on the politics of self-expression may have silently undermined, chipped away at the very foundations of democratic politics. Not only in that it has neglected the interests of the working class, who are now turning to the populist right, but also in that it has propelled individualization and undermined traditional beliefs in and traditional commitments to collective coherence, a collective common good, and so on, which again pours water onto the mills of the populist right. Now, I will come back to these issues at a later stage, but for now, the key point is that there is mounting evidence that democracy itself is not sustainable, which means that modern societies may, for their sustainability transformation, if it is to happen at all, have to look for a different political tool. Now that, I think, is quite a challenge that we've got to confront. But one may, of course, say that all this talk about post-democracy, post-politics, simulative democracy, the great regression, and so on, that all of that is really a terrible or a huge exaggeration. Is there really, one might ask, is there really a qualitative difference between the alleged crisis of democracy that we are discussing today and the one that we were discussing, say, 20 years ago or 30 years ago even? I think there is. And the reason why I think there is a qualitative difference is not that right-wing populist parties like the AfD have just come out of the German federal elections as the third strongest party, and that in this country we will probably in due course see the right-wing populists take government. I think these are symptoms, but I do not think that these are causes. The reasons why I think there is a qualitative difference today is, firstly, that the diagnosis today is no longer a lack of political interest or even the diagnosis of political apathy in particular sections of society, such as, for example, the younger generation or the so-called losers of modernization, but there seems to be an ever larger number of very diverse social groups who are by no means politically apathetic, but who are, for quite different reasons in each individual case, losing confidence in democracy and no longer believe that the further democratization is a promising strategy for resolving the issues or the problems that they think need to be resolved most urgently. Now, Jacques Rancière, in this context, goes as far as speaking of the hatred of democracy. Others are talking of a democratic fatigue syndrome. And secondly, whilst in the 1990s and in the 2000s, the critics of globalization and the critics of neoliberal policy approaches were still very optimistic that it will be possible to gradually democratize international politics, to recapture democracy and politics from neoliberal elites, and eventually build political institutions for a cosmopolitan or even a geopolitan democracy. The big novelty today, I think, is that exactly this optimism is rapidly evaporating. And liberal and representative democracy is, as such, increasingly regarded as inefficient and indeed dysfunctional for advanced modern societies. Not only dysfunctional in terms of systemic efficiency, but also in terms of emancipatory efficiency, that is, efficiency or suitability of democracy as a political tool for today's ideals of freedom, of self-determination, of self-realization, and of a good life. Put differently, the novelty today is that our contemporary societies may have modernized beyond democracy. Modernized beyond democracy, that is, in the established liberal, egalitarian, and representative sense. Exactly this modernization-induced double dysfunctionality is what I'm trying to capture with concepts such as the post-democratic turn and the legitimation crisis of democracy. It implies that it will not easily be possible to revive or to rejuvenate or to recapture democracy, be it from right-wing populists or from neoliberal elites. This diagnosis is, I think, extremely irritating, and it is extremely challenging. Yet, much of the academic literature essentially refuses to engage with this issue, preferring instead to cultivate the fading narratives about democracy and democratization, which for so long have provided reassurance and normative orientation. And this diagnosis is also exceptionally interesting because there is plenty of evidence that this post-democratic turn, this legitimation crisis of democracy, do by no means signal a final end of democracy, but they trigger a reformulation, a reconfiguration of the democratic project in line with what I want to call our values, our freedom, and our lifestyles, a formula that I suppose you're all familiar with from a different context. Our values, our freedom, our lifestyles, which in our contemporary societies we regard as absolutely non-negotiable and which we are determined to defend at any cost. So accordingly, there is a big task to explore what exactly this reconfiguration of democracy actually implies. But again, this is an issue which major parts of the literature prefer to avoid. At the end of my talk, I will say at least a few more words about this reconfiguration, but what I now really want to elaborate on a bit is, firstly, our contemporary democratic fatigue syndrome, that is, the diagnosis that in our contemporary societies, ever larger and quite diverse social groups are getting increasingly ambivalent, increasingly skeptical about democracy. And secondly, what I just called the emancipatory dysfunctionality of democracy, a concept on which the diagnosis of the legitimation crisis of democracy actually rests. So the democratic fatigue syndrome is a concept that David van Reybrouck, for example, uses extensively in this book, Against Democracy, published, I think, first in 2013 and then in English in 2016 or something like that. Democratic Fatigue is also the title of Arjun Appadurai's opening contribution to the volume The Great Regression, a book that deals with a condition that, according to the authors and according to the editor, not only affects Europe, but the whole of the modern world at large, and that therefore, the book, was published in 13 languages at the same time. So, quite an ambitious project. This diagnosis of the democratic fatigue syndrome contrasts sharply with the diagnosis of the silent revolution that Ronald Inglehart made in the 1970s, or with the diagnosis of the participatory revolution that referred to the 1970s and 1980s, or indeed with the diagnosis that Inglehart and Christian Welzel made as late as 2005 of the human development syndrome, which they argue determine the development of our modern societies and render them, even if they are formally democratic, ever more genuinely democratic. So until, that's my point, very recently, we've had the narrative of modern societies becoming ever more genuinely or authentically democratic. And the democratic fatigue syndrome diagnosis of course says the opposite. Today, this overwhelming optimism about democracy has given way to widespread skepticism and a very strongly ambivalent relationship towards democracy, which most probably every single one of us in the room here share, however difficult it might be to admit that. Talking about the recent US presidential elections, Appadurai notes the approximately 62 million Americans who voted for Trump voted against democracy. Their vote was for exit. And so it was with the election of Modi, the election of Erdogan, the election and the pseudo-elections in favor of Putin. Now, Appadurai diagnoses internationally a, quote, widespread feeling of being fed up with democracy itself. I think that this is a rather sweeping judgment, and I explicitly want to distance myself from that judgment, because I do not think that electorates in Putin's Russia, in Modi's India, in Trump's US, in Erdogan's Turkey, and in Kurz's and Strache's Austria can directly be compared to each other. But if we focus more narrowly on westernized post-industrial societies, it is true that today very diverse social groups are increasingly skeptical about democracy. Members of the economically and socially underprivileged sections of society, that is, the traditional clientele of participatory and egalitarian movements and parties, have come to realize that the emancipatory movements of past decades have not only failed to fulfill their promise of social justice, equality, and a good life for all, but have in fact further exacerbated already existing social and political inequalities. These movements have created new modes of political articulation and political participation, new avenues for political participation, but these were specifically geared towards the needs and abilities and skills of the young, articulate, well-educated and well-networked generation, and thus they have further increased their ability to have political influence and impact. But that means they have further exacerbated political inequality. And the concern of the underprivileged that liberal representative democracy is never going to remove poverty and social injustice was further reinforced by, we might say, the neoliberal embrace of the democratic project. Indeed, it is striking how in Western liberal societies, governments and public institutions and economic actors too seem to have fully adopted the language of the emancipatory social movements. Yet, in the neoliberal era, the core values which the emancipatory movements had mobilized in order to normatively challenge the established political order, have now been discovered or refashioned into tools for stabilizing and reconfirming exactly that order, to increase its, one might say, resilience and its legitimacy. As the activating state has adapted decentralization, citizen engagement, self-responsibility, flexibilization, freedom of choice, and so on, for their particular neoliberal purposes, democracy and democratization no longer are a promise for the socially excluded, but they actually turn into a threat. Jody Dean at some stage says, today to vote for democracy or to campaign for democracy is to campaign for more of the same. That is, more exclusion and more inequality. And the anger, the frustration of these socially marginalized groups about the perception that social elites use and abuse democracy and its institutions one-sidedly and unfairly for their own purposes, for their own benefit, makes significant parts of these underprivileged social groups rebel against the political establishment and put their fate into the hands of political entrepreneurs presenting themselves as rebels against the system and as defending the values of the common man and women, of the lost people of America and Austria and Germany, much more effectively than elected representatives have done so far. Now, meanwhile, I'm behind with my slides. This is where I should be. Meanwhile, the educated and generally more privileged middle classes are getting increasingly concerned about what they perceive as the moral decay and the political incompetence of an irrational, irresponsible, uncivilized, and ever-growing mob, exactly what we've got here in the three pictures, that vote for Brexit, for Donald Trump, for Recep Erdogan, or the AfD. As they are seen to present a serious challenge to what I quoted before or described before as our values, our freedom, and our lifestyles, we suddenly witness doubts being raised about the most basic principle of liberal representative democracy, that is, the universal and equal right to vote. David van Reybrouck, for example, now castigates this established belief in universal suffrage as electoral fundamentalism. It's quite interesting that in a bestseller, this argument can be made. And while in the past, declining turnout rates at democratic elections were regarded as an indicator of crisis, Jason Brennan, for example, now suggests the decline in political engagement is a good start, but we still have a long way to go. We should hope for even less participation, not more. And he actually believes that there are good reasons to exclude some people from holding power or grant them a smaller share in political power, for most citizens are incompetent, ignorant, irrational, and morally unreasonable about politics. But universal suffrage, nevertheless, puts them in a position to impose their ignorant and irrational decisions on innocent people. I keep quoting here. He conceptualizes their electoral participation as voting pollution, and drawing a comparison to the regulation of air pollution, he argues that this voting pollution too should be prevented by means of state regulation. Now, I suspect that most of us here would find this kind of comparison and this kind of terminology pretty horrendous. But I suspect that somewhere deep down, most of us also have some sympathy for the idea that some people somehow perhaps should ideally be perhaps not excluded from voting, but not have that much power, like, for example, these 27% who in Saxony last Sunday voted for the AfD. And I suspect that most of us here would also agree with Van Reybrouck's view, that's not it, wrong, that efficiency suffers under the electoral calculus, while time and again the long term and the common interest loses out. Now, of course, none of these arguments is particularly new. That's not what I'm saying. What is interesting is that these arguments are coming back, and that they are coming back in political bestsellers. It is striking how, after a phase of huge confidence and a huge confidence in public engagement, democratic participation and citizen politics, we now seem to see the pendulum, at least in some debates, swing back into the opposite direction. And whilst only recently the trend and demand had been to democratize political parties, make them more accessible for the citizenry, have more elements of direct democracy, and so forth. What we now see is political entrepreneurs like Donald Trump, like Emmanuel Macron, like Erdogan, like Sebastian Kurz, cut loose from their respective party organizations, liberate themselves from established structures of control and accountability, forge their own movement, and explicitly, in the name of efficiency and the long-term interest, and in the name of the common good, promise to go it alone. This, too, is exit from democracy. And, in fact, even environmentalists, who, as I said before, had more than anybody believed in participation and campaigned for democratization, have more recently become strikingly ambivalent about the eco-political credentials of democracy. Not only are there increasing doubts whether democratic structures are really a suitable tool for the big societal transformation to sustainability, but democratic commitments are increasingly regarded as a major cause of the present condition of unsustainability. Already in the late 1990s, Laura Westra said this: "The unquestioned acceptance of the primacy of democratic institutions presents a major obstacle to the prevention of public harms, particularly environmentally induced public risks to health." And more recently, Timothy Mitchell and others have demonstrated how the development of modern democracy is indeed inseparably intertwined with the development of the modern fossil-based economy. They speak of carbon democracy which firmly depends on the exploitation of fossil capital. Markus Wissen, in a recent article, notes democracy in the sense of more equal use of resources and sinks appears to mean in practice equality in their overuse. And Robin Eckersley, in an even more article, speaks of the complicity of liberal democracy in undermining Earth systems processes. And as regards the capacities of the modern state, which for the transition towards sustainability is generally regarded as an urgently required key actor, there is increasing doubt whether the environmental state can ever fulfill this role as long as it is dependent on democratic legitimation, as long as it is dependent on the democratic legitimation imperative. Now, suggestions that sustainability transformation necessitates Authoritarian management structures, like those of the hospital's intensive care unit, where personal power, financial gain, and personal aggrandizement are subsumed into the goal of saving human lives, and a multidisciplinary team of experts works for humanity without fear or favor, are, of course, entirely nonsensical or are pure fantasy. But the point I want to make is that alongside the firm declaratory commitment to democracy by virtually all societal actors, we are in our contemporary polities witnessing a massive erosion of confidence in democratic institutions and in democratic procedures in virtually all parts of society, and importantly, across ideological division lines. The vision of a new politics, quote, liberated from the burdens of democracy, that is Appadurai again, is by no means just the dream of neoliberal elites, but an idea that for quite diverse reasons and to quite different extents appeals to a wide range of social groups right across our contemporary societies. But to be absolutely clear, what we are talking about is democratic ambivalence, not the straight rejection of democracy. So this ambivalence, this uncertainty of whether democracy is really, and democratization the way forward, is what I think we've got to deal with. Still, this leaves us with a task to explore the causes of this proliferating democratic ambivalence, of this perception that liberal representative democracy is no longer adequate for the needs and for the kind of society, for the interests of advanced modern societies and its citizens. And we need to do so in a way, I think, that reaches beyond the standard household explanations which routinely and conveniently blame the media, corrupt politicians, globalization, neoliberal elites, or any combination of those. So I think we need, as political theorists, as sociological theorists, think a bit further. And at this point, I now want to turn to further elaborate what I earlier called the emancipatory dysfunctionality of democracy. Now, the term dysfunctionality implies that we buy into the argument that Jason Brennan makes, and that many others, of course, have made long before him, that democracy, quote, is a means to an end, but not an end in itself. Brennan suggests democracy is valuable the way a hammer is valuable. It's nothing more than a useful tool, but it's a flawed tool. Hence, we should ask if there is an even better hammer. I think he should have said a better tool. But anyway, that's his argument. I think it is indeed absolutely crucial to call to mind that democracy is not an end in itself. And the question of the suitability of democracy as a tool is indeed, I think, a starting point for an inquiry that we can usefully make. But in order to assess the usefulness, the suitability, the functionality of this tool, we need to be clear about the normative yardstick that we want to apply. That is, we need to be clear about the ends or about the purposes for which democracy may or may not be a more or less suitable tool. Now, Brennan very quickly comes to the conclusion that democracy is not functional and that therefore we may have to look for a better tool. But as regards the normative yardstick he applies, his assessment criteria, you might say, he is actually not very clear at all. So in those terms, the book is entirely useless. As I indicated earlier, there are two sets of criteria which are commonly used in the literature. The systemic functionality of democracy, of democratic structures, that is, their efficiency with regard to resolving particular problems or delivering particular social goods or services, which could theoretically also be delivered in non-democratic ways. Think of economic growth, for example, can be delivered democratically or undemocratically. So systemic efficiency relates to that. And emancipatory efficiency, in the literature it's always often called democratic efficiency. I don't like that term. Emancipatory efficiency or functionality is the functionality of democratic structures with regard to specifically democratic values, such as freedom, self-determination, equality, justice, and other values that derive from this great Enlightenment idea of the human being as a subject of inviolable dignity and inalienable rights. Now, whether or not these two sets of criteria can really be analytically distinguished from each other is a separate issue. I think it is debatable. I don't think actually I agree. But the second set of criteria is what I want to focus on now further on, and what I believe received far too little attention so far. So what we need to explore is how suitable democratic processes and institutions are for the achievement of emancipatory goals, that is, for the practical realization and implementation of our ideals of freedom, self-determination, justice, self-realization, and so forth. Our values, our freedom, and our lifestyles, as I said before. Now, these ideals, although they have always been called or referred to as emancipatory ideals, are by no means static or stable, but they have, as regards their prevailing interpretation, always been subject to change. And three respects in which, over the past few decades, prevalent notions of freedom, of self-determination, of self-realization, and so on, have indeed changed quite significantly are firstly that the individual dimension of self-determination, self-realization and identity has gained substantially vis-à-vis the collective dimension. Indeed, self-determination and self-realization are in contemporary societies more than ever a project that we pursue individually, self-responsibly, and in competition with each other. Secondly, when it comes to the modes or to the arenas of freedom, self-construction, self-realization, self-experience and so far, the material dimension has gained significantly vis-à-vis non-material modes and arenas. Indeed, shopping and consumption are not only the favorite pastime for significant parts of contemporary citizenries, but as the market has permeated virtually all areas of personal life, product choices and consumer behavior have for most people become the primary mode of self-construction, self-articulation, and self-experience. And thirdly, in contemporary societies, prevalent ideals of subjectivity, prevalent ideals of identity, and self-determination have become much more flexible, much more dynamic than earlier ideals of character and identity and personality had been. Indeed, in advanced modern societies, in competitive societies, flexibility and openness to change and innovation, ability to cope with ever-accelerating innovation are key conditions of success. And reversely, overly rigid principles, consistency, reliability, loyalty, and so forth, have become qualities which need to be very carefully managed. So in advanced modern societies, the values which most people eschew, the prevalent understandings of our freedom, our values, and our lifestyles, of our happiness, have changed quite significantly. And when assessing the functionality of democracy, exactly these prevailing values, expectations, and aspirations have to be used, or let's put it that way, are being used explicitly or tacitly, consciously or intuitively, as the normative yardstick against which the suitability or the functionality of democracy is being measured. We don't need to be conscious about that. That is, I'm suggesting, what is happening. And assessed from the perspective of these prevailing values, the traditional notions and established institutions of liberal, egalitarian, representative democracy appear as increasingly problematic. Representative democracy becomes ever more problematic because the ongoing process of modernization has not only differentiated and pluralized the once more or less coherent and homogeneous social classes or societal milieus which political parties used to represent, but it has also fragmented, flexibilized, dynamized, liquefied the individual subject and its identity, which implies that political actors are finding it ever more difficult to actually grasp and represent citizens, whereas citizens in turn find it ever more difficult to find represented by politicians or by political actors. Thus, the idea of representation becomes increasingly an inappropriate category unless, of course, we understand it in a different way. There are different understandings of representation, and at least the common, the standard interpretation becomes an increasingly irrelevant category, and the same applies by implication to the concepts of the political subject and the democratic sovereign. Now think about what happens if the idea of sovereignty, the democratic sovereign, actually dissolves. An egalitarian democracy becomes ever more problematic because we are all well aware that our values, our freedom, and our lifestyle, which we are determined to defend at any price, can only be sustained if and only be sustained as long as we manage to draw lines of exclusion within our societies and beyond our societies, which make sure that the limited available resources are reserved for ourselves. As economic growth becomes ever more difficult to achieve, and increasing mobility and migration continuously increase competition, this necessity to draw lines of exclusion becomes ever more pressing. And unsurprisingly, therefore, egalitarian and redistributive understandings of democracy, redistributive forms of politics, are becoming ever less popular, not only with the rich, but right down to the least privileged groups of society, which fully share the prevailing ambitions and values and aspirations, and at least want to realize and defend the very lowest budget version of these lifestyles. Now, I think this helps us to understand why there is so widespread skepticism about democracy. It helps us to understand why political parties whose identities rest on the fading progressive tradition, that is social democratic parties, green parties, left parties, are finding it so difficult to defend their share in electorates. And it explains why right-wing populist parties in turn appeal to voters well beyond the often cited losers of modernization. If assessed from the perspective of prevailing notions of freedom, subjectivity, and self-realization, democracy in the old sense, egalitarian, participatory, redistributive, inclusive, becomes increasingly inefficient, dysfunctional, even counterproductive, and a burden. Democracy plunges into a true legitimation crisis. And it becomes dysfunctional not only in the sense that it is no longer suitable as a tool for emancipatory purposes in our contemporary understanding, but it becomes dysfunctional also in the sense that the liquefaction, the liquidation of its point of reference, that is the autonomous subject, destroys its very foundations, its logics, its mechanics. And I think, and this is what I conclude with, the digital revolution will not only further accelerate this destruction, but perhaps it'll bring the dissolution of the subject, its autonomy, and the political sovereignty, the sovereign, to conclusion. For it dissolves the individual, its subjectivity, and identity into a mass of data which only algorithms can process, and which these algorithms, on the basis of parameters which we neither know nor control, selectively reassemble into profiles which the respective people themselves neither are aware of nor are in control of, but which nevertheless become the point of reference for all evidence-based forms of policy making. So I think that is one of the major implications of the digital revolution, that it actually completes the dissolution of the political subject, of the sovereign, and so on. So that is the point at which I want to conclude. I wanted to say a point on the metamorphosis of democracy, but as I think we've done more than enough already, I'll stop here. Thanks very much.